Okay, Doug. All right. So last November, we had Evelyn Partner came in and did a webinar with us where she talked about the local emphasis program for Utah OSHA and how they were going to be focusing on local governments with this inspection program starting this year. The program involved doing 50 entities every year until the year 2022. So basically, we still have like 5 years to go in this program where they'll be going out and visiting 50 of you every year. So it's a pretty good chance that you're going to see an inspection, sometime in the next few years, however that is. The local emphasis program is one where they actually took a look at all the local governments and they divided it up into different types of organizations. So there's over 1,000 local government entities in the state of Utah with special service districts, cities, towns, counties, and state agencies. Some state agencies are also included in this program, and they are doing a sampling of different types of entities every year. So some entities they'll be hitting about 20 of, and other entities they may only be hitting about 5 of. But we've started to see some results. And so as the year has progressed here, we've had you, our members, sharing with us some of the findings that the UOSH inspectors have been coming up with as they've been out doing these inspections. We've also been able to go into the OSHA website and pull up some of the findings as well. However, I'm not saying that we've actually compiled a complete list of all the findings from all the UOSH, LEP, or other inspections on local government entities. So it's kind of a sampling. There's about 270 different citations that we have been able to see that have been, included or written from these inspections with you all over the past year, so far in 2018. And so when also earlier last year, we did an webinar where we talked about, what were the most common findings or what were some of the most common OSHA citations nationwide. And that was, this list here shows what we came up with on that. And so for previous years, nationwide fall protection was #1, hazard communication standard was #2, scaffolding was 3, respiratory protection was 4, control of hazardous energy or lockout tagout was 5, forklifts and power industrial trucks, that was #6, ladders was #7, electrical safety was #8, machine guarding was 9, and #10 was electrical system design and general requirements. So what we have seen so far this year, it's a little bit different. A lot of the same general type of things came up in our top 10 list. And when we boil them down just by category, not specifically individual findings, but by putting them in categories, the #1 most frequent citation that we've been seeing written in the LEP program and in the voluntary compliance program so far this year has been electrical safety issues. So those are citations written corresponding to subpart S standards. So in 29 CFR 1910, in sections 301 to 399, that's subpart S, and that has to do with mostly electrical safety in general. That was 43 of the 270 citations that we saw, for 16% of the total number of citations that we've sampled. Material handling was the second most common one. That's items from subpart N, 37 of our 270, or 14%. Personal protective equipment was 14% of the findings. Walking and working surfaces was 13% of the findings. Machinery and machine guarding was 10%. Hazard communication standard was 8% of the findings. General environmental controls, which the ones that are really come up on this one is confined space entry and and I'll remember when we get to it here in a little bit. So in general environmental controls, that was 7%. Hazardous materials, just, flammable liquids or compressed gases was 4%. And then medical services was also another 4% of the findings in there. So let's take a look at what kind of things we're talking about. What are the most common ones within that subpart S, or electrical safety standards, that we saw? So subpart S basically tells us electrical equipment must be free of recognized hazards that are likely to cause death or serious physical harm to employees. And that can be a pretty broad aspect. That could be, wiring in the building. It can be damaged outlets, lack of covers, wire splices. It can be, extension cords that are used improperly or that are damaged. It can be the way your electrical systems are labeled. So there's a lot of different things in here. What we saw as being, one of the most common one was this 1910-303 E12, which was markings on the electrical panels. And so the electrical panel, we need to have certain markings on there. The real basic ones are for, voltage, current, wattage, and so forth, so that when we look at this panel, we really need to know how much power is inside of there. Some requirements are going to depend on, whether, we're under or over 600 volts. But we really need to have some basic markings on the electrical panel. So this was one of the most common ones. In fact, as an individual citation, this was the third most common cited. So it's a good idea. Take a look at your electric panel. See if you have them marked for voltage, current, wattage. Lots of times we need, especially if it's a high voltage panel, we need to see, a warning tag on there, warning of the need for arc flash protection and so forth. So that was one of the most common ones. Another one that we're looking at that was really common was just the space around electrical equipment. And generally this is electrical panels, and if you've been with us when we've done one of our inspections, we look at these things every single time, and this is a pretty common one. Not just electrical panel though. If you've got small transformers or different, electrical power equipment, in your facilities, this will apply there as well. So the standard has certain space requirements around the electrical panels. Your standard electrical panels that you have in most of your buildings need to be as wide as the electrical service panel or 30 inches, whichever is greater. And then as a general rule, it needs to be about a 3-foot space to the front of those electrical panels, and those spaces have to be kept clear. The door on the electrical panel has to be able to open at least 90 degrees, and we need to have that clear space with nothing stacked in front of these panels. And that includes things that may not be all the way up blocking the door of the panel, but they're on the ground in front of the panel, where they could be a trip hazard or maybe even a fire hazard, being right close to that panel or in front of that panel. So this floor in front of these panels needs to be kept perfectly clear. So up to 150 volts in that panel, that space needs to be 3 feet deep. Depending on the conditions, in other words, the design and condition of the panel itself, it may need to be up to 4 feet deep, depending on the voltage and, the configuration of that particular panel. If it's a high voltage panel, if it's over 600 volts, then again, depending on the configuration of this panel, that space could be anywhere from 3 to as much as 12 feet. And so, if you've got high voltage panels, then we would need to take a close look at the specific, design of that panel and what the configuration is to determine how deep that space is that needs to be maintained free and clear in front of that piece of equipment. Again, at least 3 feet wide, and could be wider depending on the equipment. One of the citations that we saw written frequently was where you have some electrical equipment, maybe a transformer or something like that, that has some venting in the side of the box or the case, where things were stacked up around that may prevent free airflow through that equipment to help keep it cool. And again, if we're keeping that space around the electrical equipment free and clear, that shouldn't be a problem, but that's something to especially pay attention to, as that could become a serious fire hazard. And as a general rule, we want to keep these spaces need to be clear, but especially combustible materials, we want to keep away from these spaces. Electrical cords is another area that was common in citations. And so things that we need to consider are the cord. Is it sufficient for what you're using it for? Is it rated to handle the load that you are using this cord for? Is the cord in good condition itself? Is the insulation damaged? Is the plug damaged? Those are things we need to be mindful of. Are we using the cord to provide electricity on a permanent basis, to something? And of course, we shouldn't be using temporary cords to provide permanent power to something. So if we do have a cord that's always being used to provide power somewhere, we need to look at having our electrical, system actually, augmented so that we have a permanent source of power where it's needed. Grounding is another issue that comes up frequently, and we see this not just on electrical cords, but sometimes on buildings or in parks and things like that. We need to make sure that the grounding system is intact, that it's protected. On your cords, for example, we need to make sure we're using a cord that have that third prong on it for a ground. We don't want to be using a cord if that third prong's been broken off or just isn't there at all. And don't forget, cords create a great trip hazard when we leave them out on the ground especially. Here's an example of a permanent use of an extension cord. So if we see cords that are going through walls, out of windows and under doorways and things like that, that's a pretty good indication that we need to provide some permanent power somewhere where it doesn't exist. So again, make sure that cord is in proper condition and being used appropriately. Another thing to think about is overloading a circuit. And so it's a common one with this is having multi-plug adapters where we plug too many items into one wall outlet where we're overloading the capacity of that circuit. Daisy chaining where we use multi-plug adapters to plug other multi-plug adapters into and so forth so that we can increase our our electrical outlets, but then we run that risk of overloading those circuits and possibly having a fire. The next most common general category was the material handling, subpart N of the 1910 standard. And things that we saw in here was storage, how we're storing materials. Are they being stacked or shelved in a safe manner? And there's some real common areas there where there were some citations. Forklifts is another area where we see quite a few citations. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, as well as cranes and sling inspections. Generally with those, I'm not going to go into any more detail on that, but just be aware, that your lifting slings and cranes need to undergo periodic regular inspections and certifications, especially when we're talking about those cranes, depending on, the size and capacity of those cranes. So storage, when we're talking about material handling, a real common citation that we saw was shelves and stacks. And so this standard, 1910.176B, tells us secure storage. Storage of materials shall not create a hazard. Bags, containers, bundles, etc., stored in tiers shall be stacked, blocked, interlocked, and limited in height so that they are stable and secure against sliding or collapse. And we saw this standard also cited in reference to shelves that had a lot of material stacked on them where they were heavy and the shelves were not secured in place, where they weren't anchored to the floor or anchored to a wall. But it also, we saw some citations where we were just kind of stacking stuff in a way that wasn't real stable and too high, where those stacks of boxes or bags or things could tip over. And so that was a real common one. Take a look at your shelves. Make sure that they are anchored appropriately so that those racks cannot tip over if that becomes a problem. On forklifts, some of the common conditions or situations that we see where citations occur are just a lack of training. If an OSHA inspector walks into your facility and they see that you have a forklift, they're likely going to ask to see your training records and to see a list of your certified operators. Well, if you don't have a training record and you don't have any certified operators, then that's a problem, especially if it's evident that this forklift is being used. So as a general rule, what we see a lot on the forklift is a training deficiency, and the certification goes along with that. And remember, it's the employer's responsibility to certify the drivers. However, there is a level of training that's required, and we often can help with forklift training, and we will help you understand how you certify your drivers or your forklift operators. Another real common one on the forklifts is a lack of a pre-shift inspection. Anytime we get this piece of equipment out to use it, we need to make sure it's safe to use. And as we go around and we've done inspections and as we do classes, it's kind of interesting because I know I'll ask people, how often do you actually use your forklift? And for a lot of you out there, it's not a piece of equipment that you use every day. In fact, I've had, a lot of organizations tell me that the forklift maybe only gets used a couple times a month and sometimes only a few times a year. And so you have a piece of equipment that's used that infrequently. It's especially important to make sure that when you start it up and go to use it, that it's in safe operating condition. The standard does require that a forklift be inspected every time, before it's used. Every shift when it's used, it needs to have an inspection to make sure it's in safe working condition, and a record of that inspection should be available there with the equipment. So again, that's something an inspector's likely to ask to see, a copy of the pre-shift or pre-trip inspection on that forklift or industrial truck. Another real common, the next most common area was subpart L, or subpart I, which is personal protective equipment. And the real common citation that we saw written on this was a lack of hazard assessment when it comes to PPE. So CFR 1910-132 D2 talks about the requirement to perform a thorough written certification that identifies the workplace, that the workplace has been evaluated for hazards. We need to make sure that we look at the workplace, we identify what kind of hazards are there. If personal protective equipment we determine is necessary as part of our program for protecting our employees from these hazards, then we need to make sure we've done an evaluation to determine that we've selected the proper type of PPE for those specific hazards that we identify in the workplace. And so that's something that, a lot of us probably haven't done, where we've actually sat down and, done a written report basically on what the hazards are in our workplace and how we address those as far as personal protective equipment. The next thing that falls into the same subpart is respiratory protection, and this is another area where there was a lot of citations out there. Specifically, the one we saw cited a lot was the 1910-134 C1, which tells us that in any workplace where respirators are necessary to protect the health of the employee, or wherever respirators are required by the employer shall establish and implement a written respiratory protection program. So if you have a written respiratory protection program and you're following it, your bases are probably going to be covered. Where we get into trouble lots of times is the inspector walks into your facility and they see a respirator, full face, half face, whatever, an N95 dust mask or, particle filter. It's going to, that's a respirator. And so if they see that you have respirators in your facility, they're going to ask about your respiratory protection program. And if you don't have a written program, that's likely going to be a violation. Now, when it comes to like N95, filtering face pieces, then, there is within the standard, we're allowed to do a voluntary use Appendix D, but you still need to have some sort of written program that outlines and makes sure that you are compliant and that you've determined that filtering face piece is safe for use, and that employees, can opt to use those, voluntarily. And so that's something we really need to consider and take a look at, and that's a common one. If we do actually need, to have a respiratory protection program because there's hazards in the workplace, that present a significant hazard that we need to use those respirators for, then we need to make sure that we have all the other parts of a respiratory protection program in place as well, as including, annual fit tests, medical evaluations, and also assessments to determine that we're using the right equipment, training on how to use and care for the equipment, and so forth. So that's a common area where we saw a lot of citations. Also within the respiratory protection program, again, I mentioned the Appendix D, so the voluntary use of respirators needs to be addressed. So as an employer, you may not identify that it's necessary to have a respirator, but the employee, may want to use, some sort of filtering face piece. And in that case, we still need to make sure that we determine that that is safe to use in our work situation, and that we have a written program that identifies that we have gone through that process of making sure that we're doing that appropriately. The next most common area where we saw citations was the walking and working surfaces section of the standard. And, one of the big ones, the most common citations we saw was just general housekeeping. And so there's different housekeeping standards that we find in OSHA standards. Basically, they tell us that, passageways, storerooms, walking surfaces, floors and areas where people are walking need to be kept clean and clear, orderly, and in a sanitary condition. So if we've got just a lot of clutter laying around, that's at a bare minimum, it's a trip hazard, and could be a lot of other hazards. It can be fire hazards and, chemical safety issues as well. So, if you have a clean shop, if you have clean storage spaces where everything is neat and organized and separated and properly stored, you have an OSHA inspector walk in and take a look at that, they're going to be pretty comfortable, and they're probably not going to dig real hard to look for problems, because a clean shop generally means a safe shop. And of course that's not a concrete rule. There's exceptions to that, but as a general rule, if we're clean and neat and organized, we're going to have a pretty safe operation there. And also within the walking and working surfaces, and we're looking at ladders, whether that's portable ladders, fixed ladders. Brent just did the safety moment earlier today on the ladder safety, and so this is a common one where we saw some violations. There was kind of a mix. Sometimes with ladders, we're looking at the need for the extensions at the top of the ladder, needing to have those 3-foot extensions above the top of your exit point on the ladder. Also on stationary fixed ladders, there's some spacing requirements to the sides, how much space you need to have to the sides of the ladders, or how much space you need to have between the rungs and the wall or the surface that the ladder is mounted on. And so those are areas where we need to make sure that we have a proper design and use of ladders in our workplace. Also within the same section is fall protection. Railings is a big one, and so making sure that we have railings that are there in the first place. Sometimes we have these mezzanines and we don't put railings up on them. It's just an area up above an office, that's got a flat surface up there, and inevitably we start stacking stuff up there. So if it becomes evident that people are up there working because we can see that stuff is stored up there, then it becomes the need for fall protection and railings. And so that's a common area. There's also deficiency in the design and condition. So the railings have certain requirements for the height of the railing. Sometimes in certain conditions there needs to be a toe board. The railing needs to be able to withstand so much force pushed against it, 200 pounds generally. And that can be for platforms. It could be railings required around an opening in a working surface. It can be railings along a stairway or stairs or steps, that we may need to have in place as well. Another area in here where we're talking about these mezzanines or these, elevated storage areas above, a mechanical room or an office space or something like that, where we just start stacking stuff up, that's really common, is not, being able to prove that we know what the safe load limit is on that surface up there. And so as a general rule, to be able to make sure that, an OSHA inspector is going to look at that and be able to verify that you're not overloading that space up there, we need to have some sort of placard posted that identifies what the load capacity of that surface is, or what the load capacity in pounds per square foot, for example, is. And so it may be necessary to get your city engineer or somebody, an engineer in there, to take a look at the construction of that deck and determine what that load capacity is and make sure that's posted so that we can verify that we're not overloading that, so we don't have a ceiling collapse in on employees or something similar to that. Also, there's just general fall protection as well, and so we saw quite a few citations where there was a lack of training. And so if we are using systems where we actually have, fall restraints or fall protection systems that we're using, working at heights, we need to make sure that employees, before they're exposed to that potential fall hazard, that they have received training, in use of the equipment beforehand. So again, the inspector is likely to ask you to produce documentation of training, different safety trainings that may be evident that are required given what we see in the workplace. Machine guarding is the next section that had a lot of just general citations in there. The most common one were just general citations for missing guarding. Some of them were a little more specific, such as, on grinders, bench grinders is a common one that we see a lot. Also, we saw quite a few of these write-ups on the missing chuck guards on the drill presses. And we've been pointing this one out for several years now to you. A lot of you still may not be aware, because most drill presses, when you go and buy them, especially in the past, they don't come with a chuck guard on them. And so we never realized that this was something that required some machine guarding. But indeed, this is a rotating piece of equipment that things could get entangled in and that you could get injured on. And so that does require some guarding on that. So the real common one where we see a lot of citation is on your bench grinders, to make sure that we have the tongue guards, the tool rests, the eye shields in place, and that the tongue guard and the tool rest have the required spacing. Also, the inspection to make sure that your stones are in good condition, that we don't have soft metal embedded in the stone, that we've done a ring test on the stones to make sure that they're not cracked and so forth. And that's a real common one where inspectors will often write citations. The next area where we saw a lot of write-ups was on the hazard communication standards. So as you know, at this time, the globally harmonized system is fully in effect, which means all of our material safety data sheets need to have been updated to safety data sheets. And we need to have updated our written hazard communication program so it's compliant with these GHS standards. So sometimes these citations may have been written just because there wasn't a written program at all, or there may have been aspects of the written program that was missing. So you need to have a written program that identifies, how you manage potentially hazardous chemicals in your workplace. There needs to be a list of the chemicals that are currently in inventory in each workplace. We need to have the safety data sheets for those chemicals that are in the workplace, and the chemicals need to have proper labeling. And if you've got the chemicals in their original container still, shouldn't be a problem. The globally harmonized system did change, what we see on labels, and so there's also a training element to this. Employees need to understand how to read the safety data sheets, what information will be found on a label, and how to read those labels. If materials have been transferred into secondary containers, they need to have, a label affixed that meets the requirements added to those containers. I mentioned before, general environmental controls, where I kind of, couldn't remember what we were talking about there. Confined space is the big one, but hazardous energy control, or lockout tagout, is the other part of this subpart J, where we saw quite a few citations written on this. So confined space and lockout tagout. So, basically with your lockout tagout program, what they're looking at is, do we have a method for putting equipment in a safe state while it's being maintained or serviced, or making sure that equipment that is not safe for use is taken out of service in a way that it can't be used, in a dangerous manner. And so the lockout tagout requirements will specify exactly, that we need to do an assessment on each lockout tagout piece of equipment, a lockout tagout procedure for each piece of equipment. So identify the steps that need to be taken to make sure that equipment is de-energized from any potentially hazardous type of energy source. And so there, again, we have specific training on these. In fact, almost all of these areas that we're talking about, there is a webinar on our website that has been recorded in the past available that you can go back and watch detailed training on just about all of these that we're talking about here today. So we need to be able to make sure that we have programs for, de-energizing and lockout, tag out on equipment. An inspector may come into a facility and see a piece of equipment that's, in dangerous operating condition. And so they may do a lockout, tag out citation because that piece of equipment isn't locked out and tagged out, or they may actually, see that you have equipment that requires that you have lockout, tag out procedures, and they may ask to see your written program and, what your lockout, tag out procedures are, and again, evidence that you have done training with your employees on your lockout, tag out program. The other part of this in these environmental controls is confined space entry. I think the big, and this one was a tie for number 10 for the most frequently cited, issue, and probably the biggest part of this was having an inventory, having evaluated our confined spaces to determine if they're permit required confined spaces, and having an inventory of those spaces. So we saw a lot of citations written on that specific aspect. However, there's a lot more to having a confined space entry program than just having an inventory of your confined spaces. So again, you want to make sure that you have a written program, that you maintain an inventory of your confined spaces, that you have a means in place, that you've established ways to prevent unauthorized entry to your confined spaces, that your employees are trained on confined space entry, that you must provide atmospheric monitoring and ventilation in those confined spaces. If your employees are entering those spaces, you have to be able to manage contractors who are working in your confined spaces, and you need to provide steps to ensure that there's safe entry, which is, if it's a permit required confined space, those steps will be, outlined on your entry permit is where that's going to come into place. Provide the necessary equipment to be able to do the entry safely, including, rescue equipment and suitable rescue services. Your confined space entry program needs to be reevaluated and reviewed at least annually. Another area, which is seems like kind of a simple thing, but we saw quite a few citations on this. In fact, this was the 8th most commonly cited, and it's actually 2 different standards that I combined, for this to be number 8. But it's CFR 1910.37B4 and 5. 4 tells us that the employer shall evaluate the workplace to determine if any spaces, that's the wrong one. That goes with confined space entry. We need to, each doorway or passage along an exit access that could be mistaken for an exit must be marked as not an exit, or clearly, marked as, what is in that space. Number 4 should actually be that we need to have exits clearly marked. They need to be visible. We need to be able to determine the direction of travel to an exit, especially emergency exits. So I apologize for that text not being right on that slide. Hazardous materials was another subpart H, where we saw quite a few citations. Compressed gas cylinders was one area where a lot of citations were written. And so as you should know, if you have these cylinders, compressed gas cylinders, they need to be stored in a way that is safe. So they need to be protected, so that they can't tip over or become damaged in any way where they, may leak or become a hazard otherwise. We also need to make sure that we have these cylinders, separated so that we don't have flammables and oxidizers close together. And the most common one we see here is your oxygen and your acetylene. But if you have any fuel gas stored under pressure and you have an oxidizer like chlorine or oxygen stored under pressure, those cylinders need to be at least 20 feet apart as a general rule. You can also engineer a fire break in between them if they need to be close together, but the most common thing is just to separate them by 20 feet. Another, citation we saw quite a few of was just storage of flammable liquids. And so this is something, there is in the standard in 1910-106-D5B, there's a table in there that identifies, the capacity or how much, flammable liquids or fuels can be stored in different types of facilities or buildings. As a general rule, and it's going to depend on the size of your facility and what kind of fuels you have and so forth. But 3 to 5 gallons. We probably shouldn't have any more than that. We should be less than that. What we may have in some portable fuel cans, and those fuel cans need to meet a certain standard. So they need to meet safety standards to have those in use. The best thing is to, have a facility, a specific area where you store those flammables that is rated for flammable storage. It could be a flammables cabinet, or you may actually have part of your building that is actually constructed and engineered and designed, to be able to contain those flammables. Another common area was medical services, and there's 2 aspects of this where we saw quite a few citations. Number one, is just having employees that are trained in first aid and having adequate first aid supplies available to them. And so, this citation could have been written because we didn't have any first aid equipment, or maybe what was in our first aid supplies was diminished, it was insufficient, or it was old and no good anymore, whatever it might be. Or it could have been just, not having a plan for how we get first aid or medical care for an employee. If we can't get employees to medical assistance within a certain period of time, then we need to make sure we can provide at least some basic, first aid and emergency assistance, with our staff that we have on hand. So that may require some training as well. Also, under the same subpart, we have a requirement that we have, eye washes and drench showers if you have, potentially hazardous materials that, it could be corrosive or otherwise injurious if they come into contact with skin or eyes. And so citations with this could range from not having, the eye wash or the drench shower at all, where there are chemicals and there's an obvious need to have that device, that emergency equipment installed, or it could be a lack of inspection on the equipment. We need to have regular documented inspections that this equipment is functioning properly and in good condition. And maybe, storing things in the bowl of the eye wash station, like dropping nuts and bolts or tools in there, which we're not supposed to do, and so forth. So that was a common one as well. So just kind of in summary, here's the top 10 most common citations that we've seen out of the 270, citations that we were able to review that have been associated with LEP and involuntary compliance inspections of local governments here in Utah during 2018 so far this year. Number one was shelves and stacks of materials. And so again, look to see that your shelves are anchored to the wall or to the floor, and that stacks of boxes, bags, and so forth is stacked in a way so that they are stable and not going to fall over. We also need to think about the height and the risk of injury when we are stacking things too high. That creates some ergonomic, issues, potential lifting hazards as well. Respiratory protection was the second most common that we saw. And so make sure that if you've got respirators, even N95 filtering face pieces, that you have some, sufficient written respiratory protection program that you are following, even if it's just to identify, that you have an Appendix D program and that's allowed, and to verify that, we've evaluated to make sure it's safe to use those types of filtering face pieces and for our employees to use them. The third most common one was the labeling of the electrical panels, with the voltage, wattage, current, as well as, arc flash hazard warning, depending on, the capacity of that panel. The fourth most common one was machine guarding, missing machine guards on tools and equipment. The fifth most common one was not having done the PPE hazard assessment. The sixth most common one was just general housekeeping, messy areas, with trip hazards, slip hazards, and other, conditions related to housekeeping that created hazards in those workspaces. The seventh most common one was not having space around the electrical equipment, mostly electrical panels, making sure that they weren't blocked and that those doors can be opened and that we've got the required space around those and not blocking any ventilation that that equipment may require. The eighth most common one was the egress signage, the exit signs, having your exits clearly marked. Those exit signs, generally need to be self-lit, and they need to be visible in a clear line of sight and indicate the direction of travel to, an exit, especially, for emergency exits, and where you have areas where an exit or a door may look like it's an emergency exit where it's not. It needs to be identified as not an emergency exit. And this is most common in basements, for example, where a door looks like it may be, a door going outside and it just goes into a dead end. So in an emergency, we want to make sure people know not to go into that door. The ninth most common one was lockout tagout, deficiencies in lockout tagout programs. And then tied for the 10th most common citations that we saw out of these 271 citations was confined space entry, mostly not having your confined space inventory, and the general ladder safety rules on fixed and portable ladders both. So, any questions?
Yes, Doug, I do have one question here, and I was actually just looking up a letter of interpretation on that.
Oh, good. So you can answer the question.
Yeah, I didn't want to leave you hanging. Just throw that out to you there. We did have one question on. Can you email us a list of the top 10 items so we can focus on them?
Absolutely. That'll be included in the materials that we'll email out to you, as well as a PDF of the presentation. And of course, this recording will be available to view at any time.
Yeah. So, and the recording will be posted up as soon as we get IT support, and our IT guy is in Hawaii. So it may not be posted today. The other question I have here, Carrie asks, what would be considered near proximity in regards to a clinic or hospital location near the workplace? And I didn't want to throw Doug to the wolves on trying to answer that one. So I pulled up, there is a letter of interpretation from let's see, from OSHA. It says, while the first standards do not describe the number of minutes, OSHA has long interpreted the term near proximity to mean that emergency care must be available within no more than 3 to 4 minutes from the workplace. Okay. So hopefully that answers that question. Basically means that you need to provide that.
Or the paramedics need to be across the street.
Yeah, 3 to 4 minutes is basically across the street. So let's see. Dan asks, is it okay to just list all manholes as confined spaces in general?
Well, when we're talking about sewer systems, for example, there are some different exceptions or rules on that. They are confined spaces. So when you're doing an inventory, you should have an inventory of the specific locations. And so, if you're talking about, manholes that need to be entered, whatever those, are, you do need to have specific locations identified for those. In addition to that, you need to have done an assessment of the hazards in those confined spaces in order to help you determine whether it needs to be a permit-required space, and if it is a permit-required space, what the entry procedures are going to be. However, you may have multiple confined spaces that have the exact same types of conditions in them, and so some of that can be, pretty much standardized as you're doing that identification, but you do need to be able to identify the location of all your confined spaces. But Jason, remind me on sewer system manholes, what was the requirement on that? I know we've seen some cities and places where they actually do identify that as a permit required confined space, but I don't think that's generally necessary.
Yeah, so sewer manholes are deemed permit required confined spaces. There's no way out of that one. They are in the, in the standard. It basically says you can't call these non-permit required because of the multiple hazards, and you can't make those an alternative entry space either. So what does that mean? Does that mean, Dan says, we've got over 7,000 manholes in the system? Well, it's going to be a long list.
Yeah.
And the reality is there are manholes and there are manholes. I mean, you can have a sewer manhole that's a pretty benign thing. It's always going to have some hazards. But then there are others in your system, and anybody that's dealing with sewer systems knows that there's that one manhole that, hey, that's going to have hydrogen sulfide or low oxygen or whatever. That's a bad manhole for whatever reason. And so we want to have those on the list. So yeah, I'd put them on a spreadsheet and list those out. Many of you, if you've got 7,000 manholes in your system, you probably have a GIS system that you can use to tie that information together. If there's something specific about a certain manhole, a certain location, a hazard that doesn't exist elsewhere, or problems that you've identified, those should be listed in that list. And OSHA's been pretty consistent in making sure that we have all those confined spaces listed.
And again, your sewer or water department should have an inventory already of all your manholes in their system. If they don't, they need one. So, that should probably already exist where you can get that information pretty easily. And if not, then yeah, someone does need to do some work there. Yeah, very good. All right, well, it looks like that's all the questions I see here. I know there may be some of you out there who have additional questions or concerns. Please don't hesitate at all to give us a call. That's our job, is to help you get better and to keep people safe. And so give us a call, let us know, send us an email, and we'd be happy to help out wherever we can. I know a lot of the organizations that have had an unannounced OSHA inspection were pretty surprised about this. And wow, they just showed up. And there have been some small organizations that I kind of said, wow, myself, and said, I'm kind of surprised that they got hit this early in the process. But you can expect a visit. And that's the poll I should have put up, Doug, was how many of you had an OSHA inspection in the last year or 2 years? I should have done that. Anyway, but I'd be prepared for that. Doesn't look like any more questions. Final word, Doug? That's it. Just review, especially these top 10, and take a look at your facilities and operations. Make sure you've got the written programs in place. Make sure you've got training in place, and make sure you have documentation of the training. We provide a lot of your training for you through these webinars or sometimes through other classes that we do, but it's very important that you make sure you have a record of who's attended the trainings and what those trainings were, because when the OSHA inspector shows up, they're going to be asking you for a copy of your training record. They're not going to, give the trust a call to see who attended a training. And quite honestly, the numbers of people that we train makes it very difficult for us to extract that information for you. So it's important that you keep track of who's attended those trainings and have those records. Take a look at some of these other areas where we saw specific, frequent problems, like with your electrical panels and material handling, shelves, and things like that, and just make sure that everything's safe. Remember, especially, part of your TAP program, and hopefully you're all engaged in the Trust Accountability Program, is to be doing inspections of your facilities. And, this is a good reminder of things that you should be adding to or including in your facility and safety inspections that you should already be doing on all your facilities. So if you have any questions about any of these specific topics, feel free to give us a call, and also take a look at our list of recordings of past webinars, because there's the vast majority of these items we touched on here are things that we've done detailed webinars on in the past, and they're available for you to view.
All right. Thanks, Doug. I appreciate it. Great job. folks, if you got any questions, give us a call, send us an email. We're happy to help out wherever we can. We will post this webinar recording up as soon as we can. We'll follow that up with an email to let you know that when it's posted, along with the top 10 list and a PDF of the slides to help you out there. But once again, give us a call if you need some help. All right, folks. Thanks everybody for attending. Go out and have a safe day.